Good evening. From the University Place Conference Center on the campus of Indiana University-Purdue University, Indianapolis. On behalf of the Indiana Debate Commission, welcome to the first of 3 debates for the U.S. Senate. I am your moderator, Mizell Stewart. This is the Central Indiana Debate. The Northern Indiana Debate will be held on October 22nd in Fort Wayne, and the Southern Indiana Debate will be held on October 25th in Vincennes. As part of our mission to put voters first, you can still submit your questions for the remaining 2 debates by logging on to our website, www.indianadebatecommission.com. The 3 U.S. Senate candidates will answer questions from voters for the next hour. Hoosiers watching and listening to dozens of television stations, radio stations, and websites across the state, as well as on C-SPAN, will consider the candidates' answers. Now, the candidates drew lots for lectern position and the order in which they will answer questions. Immediately next to me is Democrat Brad Ellsworth. In the middle is Libertarian candidate Rebecca Sink-Burris, and on the end is Republican Dan Coates. The candidates and the campaigns have agreed to the rules of tonight's debate. Here are the highlights. Candidates will have 1 minute and 30 seconds to answer most questions. But I may announce that one answer's length will vary to allow the candidates enough time to answer a general final question. As moderator, I may cut off a candidate who exceeds the time or call for additional time to fully answer a question. It is important to note that all of the questions that will be posed tonight come from Hoosier voters and were reviewed by a committee of the Indiana Debate Commission. The candidates know to use only small notes and no props. Before this broadcast began, we reminded members of our live audience of our house rules as well. Now the candidates will each have 30 seconds to introduce themselves, and we will start with Mr. Ellsworth.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Thank the Indiana Debate Commission for sponsoring this forum tonight. The decision to run for the United States Senate is very serious and took a lot of consideration. It should also be very serious to the people watching this debate tonight. My career was in law enforcement, 25 years, first as a deputy sheriff and then as the sheriff of my county. I think there's 2 things in this debate that are very important. Who's going to work tirelessly to bring jobs back to Indiana and this country, and who's going to fight against the special interests in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Mr. Ellsworth. And now, Ms. Sink-Burris.
In politics this year, there's been a strong sentiment to vote the bums out. But the old parties haven't listened. Instead of new voices, they've given us voices from the past. Voices favored by party leadership, not by the voters. As your Libertarian candidate, I'm an ordinary citizen running for office. I represent the change that people have been asking for. I represent the ideals that this country was founded on and that have made this country great.
And now Mr. Coates.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart, and thank you to IU and Purdue for letting us use this venue, a very familiar place for me, having been an alumni of this institution, graduating from law school, and grandson Charlie born across the street at IU Hospital just a year ago. This is a serious time, and it deserves serious consideration. I'm glad we're having this debate. I got into this race because I was distressed over the direction our country was heading. I thought we needed a change. I think the debate tonight will show that we need to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Coates. Now let's meet the first person who will ask a question of the candidates. She is Tanya Bond, who is an attorney in Indianapolis. Tanya, thank you so much for coming tonight. And what is your question for the candidates?
Good evening, candidates. Indiana's public schools are in a serious state of crisis. What are your specific ideas about how to help Indiana's public schools at the national level, including your thoughts on No Child Left Behind and any reform you would sponsor and/or support? Thank you.
Mr. Ellsworth, you are first.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm glad you asked that question first because I think of all the things we'll talk about tonight and all the things that we review all go back to our children's education. There's not a more important investment that we can make than our children's education. And I think that when we look at our kids and how they learn, it's not all one test, one day. They don't all learn the same. So I think an investment in charter schools, in our public schools, and promoting private institutions is very important. And to answer your question about No Child Left Behind, I think the ideal is good. I think the goal of that is good. But it doesn't work the same way across our country for every child. And so I think we need to look at that legislation. Surely we shouldn't leave any child behind. But the investments we make in our children and their education are very important. My daughter's a third-year educator. We shouldn't be having teachers buy the pens, the paper, the protractors, their chairs, and their filing cabinets to help educate our kids. And so we need to make every effort to make sure that our children get the education they need. Thank you.
And next we'll hear from Rebecca Sink-Burris.
My background is in teaching, and I have taught in both the public schools and in private schools. And I believe that education is much too important to be left in the hands of a government monopoly. Like all monopolies, they do not serve their constituents well. You don't get choice, you don't get availability, you don't get innovation, and it is just a shame and a crime that low-income students are trapped in failing schools, and that absolutely must change. And the Federal Department of Education really has not been successful. No Child Left Behind is just the last of many programs that have not improved educational scores ever since the Educational Department was developed. I think we need to phase the Department of Education out, give block grants to the states. Surely there are people in each state who can figure out how to service every child in the educational system and not leave any child behind. The important thing we must add to education is choice. We have to empower parents to be able to make educational choices for their children. And this means allowing the money to follow the child and allowing the parent to choose what school, public or private, their child gets to go to. One size doesn't fit all, and even different children in the same family may need a different type of school and different type of education.
And now we will turn to Mr. Coates.
Thank you. Our Constitution states that those powers not specifically enumerated to the federal government should be left to the states. That's our 10th Amendment to the Constitution. Education, I think, falls in the category of state involvement in state control. The federal government has created a huge bureaucracy, the Department of Education, which has done little to improve the scores and to improve the education of children in the public school system. States have the flexibility to promote choice, to let parents make those decisions, and to give low-income students the opportunity to escape a failing school and have the opportunity to gain an education that many others have and that they are denied. That flexibility is critical, I believe, in improving our education system. If we allow the federal government to dictate how our children are educated through our public system, you get one size fits all. And it has to meet the requirements for Miami, New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Chicago, etc. Every state is different, every community is different. States are in a much better position, and parents are in a much better position to decide what is best for their children.
Our next question was submitted by John Thompson, a utility worker who lives in Hartsville in Bartholomew County. He would like to know, what are the effects, negative or positive, of the Obama health care plan, and how will Hoosiers be affected? How would you change the plan, and why? We'll start with Mr. Ellsworth.
Well, as you know, I voted for the health care plan that came before us. It was important that we took, when I first started to run for Congress 4 years ago, my first meetings with constituents were that if you get elected, please do something about the rising cost of health care in this country. I'm proud that we took it on. I think that it does some great things. I think that it eliminates pre-existing conditions for children and then eventually for adults. It finally closes the donut hole for seniors so that when they get to a certain point of using medications, they don't have to go into bankruptcy or stop taking medicine. It eliminates the caps. So if you get sick and in a lifetime sickness, you don't spend your whole entire savings on your health care. It gives tax breaks to small business so they can afford to provide health care. And I think that's a very important first step. Is the bill perfect? Absolutely not. Will it be added to and deleted from? It will. But it was a good first step, and we should do it.
Ms. Rebecca Sink-Burris.
Healthcare is the same as any other service or commodity. It is best provided by the free market. And make no mistake, we have not had a free market in healthcare for quite a while. And that is the main problem of why our healthcare has gotten so expensive. When we look at the causes of this expense, we find that government is involved in almost every case. And the recent healthcare bill has done nothing to lower costs, and in fact is going to raise costs dramatically. And there are also unintended consequences. It sounds great to allow children to not be denied insurance for pre-existing conditions. But in real life, what happens is that insurance companies stop offering policies for children. And that is happening in our state today. So we need to think very carefully. The first thing we need to change in healthcare is having it linked to employment. This is a leftover from World War II, when there were price controls and wage controls, and employers could not increase your salary, so they gave you insurance and were allowed a tax deduction for that. If everyone got a tax deduction for buying insurance or any medical care needs, then that would very drastically change the setup and make the price mechanism work to bring the price down.
Mr. Dan Coates.
I think this health care bill is one of the prime examples of what is wrong with Washington at a time of economic distress. Now moving into its third year, people out of work. The Obama administration, Nancy Pelosi, and supported by my opponent, as he has just acknowledged, thought that forcing through a 2,000-page, trillion-dollar health care reform plan for this country, rather than focusing on getting Americans back to work and getting our job and getting growth going again. And this was a pent-up 25-year liberal wish dream, and when they had the votes to push it through, and my opponent was one of those very late votes that brought it to fruition. It imposed upon all of us taxes, mandates, spending. I have traveled this state. I have talked to dozens of doctors, dozens of nurses, dozens of practitioners, insurance companies, medical providers. I have found no one that thinks that this is the way to deal with legitimate reforms that have to be made. We can make provisions for preconditioning existing conditions without passing a mega 2,000-page bill that costs this state and its taxpayers $3.16 billion over the next 10 years. It eliminates the Healthy Hoosier Plan, the $400 million the governor negotiated. All that is out the window because now Washington has to run all of our health care.
Our next question comes from Pete Mangant, who is on the faculty of Ivy Tech in Indianapolis and who is joining us here tonight in person. Pete, thank you for being here. What is your question for the candidates?
In your view, what are the benefits and drawbacks of term limits, and how would you vote on such a proposal?
We're going to change the order of response, and we will start with Ms. Sink-Burris.
I think term limits have pluses and minuses. It would very much help in the case of gerrymandered districts so that we do get some more choice and turnover in the Congress and the Senate. The Congress, not the Senate. We're obviously elected statewide. But politics has become so divided almost equally between Democrats and Republicans at this point that oftentimes when it comes to the general election, there's only one candidate running. And that does not give Americans any choice, and term limits would help to increase the choice, which I think would be very good, and I would vote in favor of term limits. Part of what you lose, though, in term limits, and you have to take that into consideration, is the experience of being in office, and that is of value. So we don't want to make the term limits too short so that we aren't being able to really fully take advantage of the experience that people do need to do a better job.
Next, Mr. Dan Coates.
Well, I introduced the concept of term limits, and I pledged personally that I would live by that pledge to serve no more than 2 terms in the Senate. That's why I left after serving those 2 terms in 1998. I then entered the private sector. I had the wonderful opportunity to serve as ambassador to Germany for nearly 4 years, then came back to the private sector. I'm running again, as I said in my opening comment, because I just couldn't stand idly by and watch what was happening to the country I love, watch what was happening to Indiana, and seeing, I think, Hoosier values of responsible spending, no taxing, balanced budget, limited government, being turned upside down. The massive growth of government in Washington is out of control. The spending's out of control. Now they're coming back and saying, well, yeah, we had to spend all this money, but so you have to pay for it with taxes. We have tax rates that are going to go up for every American citizen unless Congress deals with it, and yet they adjourn to come home to campaign without taking action. These current tax rates expire and are raised in every category on December 31 at midnight. And Congress now is going to rush back in a lame duck session with people that no longer hold office because they've been defeated or have retired. That is not the way we ought to deal with very serious issues. And term limits gives you the freedom to know that your decision, you're not there to build a career for a lifetime. You're there to do the best job you can, and then you'll leave and return to the private sector.
And now, Mr. Ellsworth.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to step back just for a minute because Mr. Coates left a few details out. His 18 years in Congress, if they would have dealt with health care then, maybe it wouldn't have come up when I went into Congress a couple years ago. It was also endorsed. He had dozens of meetings. I had probably thousands of meetings about health care. People that said, we have to do this, we have to do something. Little girls that had juvenile diabetes, nurses that had crippling arthritis saying they couldn't get insurance. I'm proud that we took it on. It'll be fixed. The AMA endorsed it. The American Hospital Association endorsed health care. As far as term limits, I think voters, our Constitution spells out the way that people are elected. I really don't think you're going to have to worry about term limits with me. But Mr. Coates also left out a few details. After his 18 years in Congress, when he said he term limited himself, he actually negotiated his deal with the lobbying firm Vernon Lippert the first time. So while he was in Congress, he was negotiating his deal. Then for 2 years, then he was assigned to the ambassador to Germany, and then went back in, and 8 days after he came home to the United States from Germany, he had another lucrative job with King & Spalding lobbying firm, and has done that for the last 5 years before he moved back to Indiana to run for this seat.
Mr. Moderator, is it possible for me?
You will have the opportunity to begin with the next question. So let me ask the question, and if you have time remaining, you may respond to Mr. Ellsworth.
All right.
Our next question was submitted by Paul Morgan, a retiree from Indianapolis. Mr. Morgan would like to know, unemployment appears to be the most important issue during this campaign and will undoubtedly haunt us well beyond the November election. What are your plans to reduce it? How much will reducing unemployment cost? And how do you intend to implement any solutions you offer? And we will start with Mr. Coates.
Well, Mr. Stewart, I really feel I need to address that previous question. I regret that campaigns have to be turned into personal accusations. I think the issues that face Hoosiers are serious enough and face Americans are serious enough that we ought to be debating those issues. I guess I have to say that I'm not sure where my Mr. Congressman Ellsworth is coming from on negotiating a deal. The majority leader, former majority leader of the United States Senate, George Mitchell, a Democrat, and the former majority leader of the United States Senate, Robert Dole, both contacted me and asked if after I left the Senate, actually they contacted me after that and said, when you leave the Senate, we would like to talk to you, period. A number of people said that. I said, under the laws, I'm not able to negotiate anything, nor do I want to negotiate anything. In fact, I took a month off after I left because I didn't even want to think about what was next. It was then that they approached me to join them as special counsel. It was a privilege to be asked to join two former majority leaders, one a Democrat and one a Republican, at a very respected law firm. And so I think that needs to be corrected, and I see that I've used my time. I'll try to catch up on the question during the next time frame.
And now Mr. Ellsworth.
Putting people back to work, put Americans back to work is the #1 thing we can focus on in this country today and in the Congress. The way that we need in government not to create federal jobs, but to create the atmosphere that allows for private jobs to create and businesses to create jobs. One thing we have to do is cut the red tape for businesses. so they know what to expect. We have to give them permanent tax relief so they know how to do their books and they know what to expect. That's what's going to forward private investment and grow our jobs. We have to stop, cut the loopholes that allow countries to ship jobs overseas. We've worked on this already. We have to do more. I was in a city, Wabash, Indiana, just a few weeks ago. They pink slipped 800 Hoosiers. They moved those jobs to Mexico and Canada. By the way, my opponent, Dan Coates, was the lobbyist for and the consultant for Cerberus, the company that bought it, sold it. The part of the deal was to shut down that company and move those jobs. They qualified for federal assistance because they moved trade agreements like NAFTA that have caused us 50,000 jobs in our state, and I think that's where we have to start.
And finally, Ms. Sink-Burris.
Hoosiers, are you ready for a change? Jobs is issue number one. And after 8 years of Bush and now 2 or 3 years with Obama, the situation has not improved. The Republicans are running us off a cliff of debt and government spending at 60 miles an hour. And then the Democrats came in and blew right past all of Bush's records and are driving off that same cliff at 90 miles an hour. But they're still going off that cliff. And our country is going to take years and years if we ever recover. Libertarians believe it's time to change direction. It is time to go back to the founding fathers and their ideals of free market economics, which produces prosperity and jobs for everyone. I can give you 2 quick examples. In countries, areas like Hong Kong, Singapore, where they have low taxes and low regulations, but also they have property rights and the rule of law, the economy is bustling, it's zooming, it's growing. And then an economy where it is controlled from the top, to the point that their people were just told they could raise vegetables for their own use. It was now legal. That's Cuba. Which way do you want to head?
Your time has expired. On to our next question, which comes from Fletcher White, a scientist from Indianapolis. He would like to know the following. Many economic and fiscal experts believe that extending tax cuts for the wealthy is fiscally irresponsible. What is your stand on this issue and why? And we will start with Ms. Sink-Burris.
Raising taxes on anyone in this economy, any sector of the economy, is unconscionable and the wrong direction. But especially raising taxes on the very sector of our economy that produces new jobs, small business. Small business owners, if these taxes are increased, and this is a tax increase, not just letting the cuts run out, it's a gigantic tax increase, bigger than we've ever had at one time in this country. Small business will not be able to grow us out of this recession. They're already struggling to bring people back and to create more jobs. The health care bill that is piled on top of this, they don't have the confidence to even go out and add more people to their workforce. But the other component of not raising taxes during a steep recession is to stop digging the hole we're in. We have to stop spending. And it really wouldn't be that hard. And I hope I'll get the chance to talk about how we could bring about a balanced budget here in some of the next questions.
Next, Mr. Dan Coates.
Thank you. I'll try to take the opportunity to answer both those questions that have been raised that I didn't have time to answer the first one. Getting Americans back to work requires ending this job-killing, massive tax and spend, and big government efforts coming out of the Obama administration, supported by Mrs. Pelosi, who has authored many of these bills and supported nearly 90% of the time, both health care and stimulus that didn't stimulate, by Congressman Ellsworth. This is no time to raise taxes. Again, as I said, you pass massive spending programs, then you turn around to Hoosiers and say, now you've got to pay for it, when they have resisted these programs from the very start. It was clear that the vast majority of Hoosiers, about a 2-to-1 ratio, were against this health care program. And anyone who has listened to Hoosiers and talked to the job makers in this state have understood that health care puts another burden on them, forcing them to think about outsourcing because of the taxes and the regulations and the health care mandates, and a government, a president who is anti-private business, all imposed upon them. No wonder they want to think about moving out. So we have got to extend these current rates, and should not be just let to run out and then not able and add to taxes of
Mr.
people
Coates,
at this particular
your time has expired.
Trying to cram
I'm
in
sorry.
too many things in one
Mr.
one
Coates,
response.
your
Thank
time's
you.
expired. Mr. Ellsworth.
I can answer this pretty quickly. We probably all three agree that the tax cuts now is exactly the wrong time to raise and talk about taxes on anybody. The tax breaks should be extended. They were sunsetted for a reason. They were put a limit for a reason so we could look. But now is not the time to raise that. In fact, we need to go farther. We need to reform our entire tax code. It's too complex for small businesses, and it's too complex for families. That's a pretty simple answer. I'd like to go back to something Mr. Coates said in the same Senate debate in 1992, because he just gave the same quote that he gave in 1992 when he ran for Senate before. He said that what you should do is when you go serve is then go home and work in the private sector. He never did that. He served his 18 years in Congress, went to a lobbying firm, was assigned to Germany as ambassador, and then went to another lobbying firm. He hasn't paid taxes in Indiana in years, hadn't held a driver's license, has not voted in Indiana in 10 years. He's got a home in Virginia and a home in North Carolina. That's not, Dan, I'd like to remind you what you said when you debated Joe Hogstad. You said then you should move back home with the people that you represent. You never did.
Joining us here tonight to ask the next question is Paulette Vandergriff, a retiree and community volunteer from Greenfield, Indiana. Paulette, we are so glad you're here. What is your question for the candidates?
Thank you. My question is, since the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in the Citizens United case and the U.S. Senate's inability to reach a vote on a bill that would require disclosure on campaign contributions, would you pledge to sign on as a sponsor or co-sponsor of Senate Bill 752, the Fair Elections Act now? This bill would make elected officials accountable only to their constituents by allowing candidates to run for office on a blend of small contributions and limited public funds. Thank you.
And we will start with Mr. Coates.
Thank you. I think disclosure is important. People need to know who is funding our races. One thing I regret is that the First Amendment, which we have to uphold, allows outside groups to put ads on either for us or against us. I think we ought to control our own voice and our own message, and that ought to be what's put before the Hoosiers. But of course, the court has said that outside organizations with First Amendment rights can put those ads on. But I think disclosure, there's more than disclosure. I think the disclosure needs to show where that is coming from. Congressman Ellsworth has received more special interest money, percentage-wise, than any other candidate running for the United States Senate, based on his own reports. So if you're talking about getting support from Hoosiers, I think that's important that Hoosiers know where that money is coming from, and those special interests are providing the largest percentage of any candidate running for the Senate in the entire United States.
Our next candidate, Brad Ellsworth.
Well, thank you very much. I think that the bill is proposed, and of course we want to look at the bill and read the bill on that issue. But certainly I disagree with the Supreme Court decision on that. I respect this court and its decision. I respectfully disagree with that. I think that sunshine on where the money comes from these campaigns is extremely important. And I think we have to turn around and correct that in the Senate. We'll look at the bill and for that. But I'd like to comment also on what Mr. Coates just said, that I've received more money. In the last financial reports, Mr. Coates raised 3 times the money that I raised. And we'll see in just a couple weeks what he raised in this quarter. But if you look at my Rolodex, it's nothing like Mr. Coates's. If you look at his FEC reports, he's taken as much, I would venture to guess, many times more in special interest contributions than I have. And again, We'll see when the report comes out. I know his commercial's up about 5 to 1 and spending about 5 to 1 what I'm spending on television. That money all didn't come from Indiana. Let's look at what the special interest that he has tied himself to as a former person, a former lobbyist in Washington, D.C., that has over his firm 100 clients, 100 special interests that he worked for personally, and 40 that he's listed out of his 800 pages of lobbying reports. As you sift through that, I don't know how he's going to cast a vote in the Senate without a conflict of interest.
Ms. Sink-Burris.
I have taken no money from special interests. I am running my campaign on small donations from individuals. Now, if there's an independent group out there who would like to put on radio ads or TV commercials that would help my campaign, I would welcome that. I would expect you to disclose where the money comes from. But there also is a downside to disclosing where the money comes from. If you live in a small community, you sometimes have to tread very carefully in the political seas because the party in power will often take it out on you if you have donated to the other party. So there is a double-edged sword here. It is good for openness, but it also does squelch free speech, which I think is extremely important in our elections. But please do not be fooled tonight by candidates who sound libertarian when they want to get elected, who have pledges to the American people, etc. Every time that they get into office, they renege on those promises and they grow government. Democrats and Republicans both come from the party of big government. It's two different factions, and that's the only difference. You have a choice this year. You can vote for smaller, constitutionally sound government.
Moderator's privilege. Mr. Coates, what does Mr. Ellsworth have wrong about you? You have 30 seconds to answer.
Well, thank you for that opportunity. He has totally mischaracterized what I have done. We have put that out for everyone to see. They can look at it. But much of the charges that have come out of Washington and come out of his party and come out of his campaign have misstated completely, in many cases, totally false. And we have proven that, and independent sources have proven that. It's the tired old Washington game of if you don't want to talk about what you did in Washington, if you don't want to talk about what your party has done in the last 2 years, you put out a distraction and focus your attention.
30 seconds.
On
Mr.
the
Ellsworth,
character
what
of
does Mr. Coates have wrong about you?
Well, I'd like to respond to that if I might, Mr. Stewart. Everything I've said is a result of Mr. Coates' 800 pages in lobbying. If you'll go to factcheckdancoates.com, I've got documentation, his documentation. Either he's not telling the truth or his law firm is not, and that's against federal law. So he can say that. Again, it's the tired old Washington game, like he just said. You could say that, but the facts are the truth. He's left out. He talks about being an ambassador. Never once has he mentioned
Mr. Ellsworth, your
being a
time is
lobbyist.
up.
Thank you.
Ms. Sink-Burris, do you have anything to offer in this wonderful tennis match?
I am not beholden to any special interests. I take the Constitution seriously and would govern from that standpoint, using the free market to build prosperity for Indiana's citizens, rather than government schemes that never work.
That's enough of the moderator's privilege. Now back to our citizens. Robert Rawlings, a retiree, is here tonight from Noblesville, Indiana. Mr. Rawlings, what is your question for the candidates?
Since the approval rating of Congress is so low and so many citizens are being forced to sacrifice as a result of the poor economy, would you be willing to sponsor legislation to repeal the generous compensation plan and expense allowances now enjoyed by government officials and replace them with a package more comparable to what a majority of taxpayers receive, to include participating in Social Security and a new health care plan?
Our first candidate, Brad Ellsworth.
Well, that's a great question, and when people are hurting in Indiana or across our country, we should pay too, and we should feel it. Again, that talks about cutting government spending, signing a balanced budget amendment. We can do that. That should be our mantra in Washington, D.C. I've supported that legislation, but we do have to in our own way. When I couldn't vote against a raise for Congress in my very first year, I gave that raise to charity. We were successful the next 2 years in canceling any kind of raise in compensation for ourselves, members of Congress. Our health care bill, although on the internet sometimes you see that we have a lucrative health care bill, I have Blue Cross Blue Shield, probably like a lot of people in this room and in the audience, that we pay for, that is just like everyone else's. But certainly, we have to tighten our belts across the board, across government, and that includes the elected officials.
Our next candidate, Rebecca Sink-Burris.
Yes, I would have no problem with that. But I would like to take the pay cuts further, because right now our country is very much hurting, and federal workers get paid almost double in salary and benefits what a comparable position would pay in the private sector. That's unsustainable, and it's wrong. And we need to cut those salaries, cut those benefits, get things more in line with what the private sector has before we add to any government spending and add to any government programs. It's very important not to set us up as two classes of people, people who work for the federal government and people who work to pay the taxes that support the federal government. The government doesn't produce jobs. It's the private sector that produces wealth and jobs. The only sector growing right now is the government sector. Well, it's growing by taking money from your pocket and putting it into the government sector, which never operates as efficiently or cost-consciously or even politely as the private sector does. So it's very important for us to rein in those costs that have given unfair advantage to people in the government.
And finally, Dan Coates.
I think, Robert, the answer is yes. Congress ought to live by the laws that it asks its citizens those laws are imposed upon to live by. And I think that would be a very constructive step going forward, and I'd be happy to introduce that in Congress if the people choose to send me there. We also, of course, need to balance our budget, but what we see growing here is Congress, the only entity that has not tightened its belt in this very serious recession, the worst downturn in the economy since the Great Depression. Families have had to tighten their belt. Businesses have had to tighten their belts. This state government, our Indiana government, has had to tighten its belt by trimming government spending. Only the federal government has expanded exponentially. The health care bill will add tens of thousands of new government employees. And it's right, their pay is higher than the average worker in America. And I think that needs to be addressed. But we're not going to balance a budget if we go to Congress and under the last 2 years of spending beyond anybody's imagination, $1 trillion stimulus bill that did not stimulate workers and get people back to work, $1 trillion health care bill that people don't want and think reforms could be made much more sensibly at far less cost, bailouts. The spending here has been greater than at any other time in our history. As a proportion of, in our debt that we're putting our children and grandchildren into is something they'll never work out of. That's where we need to start with what's happening in this government right now.
Thank you, Mr. Coates. Next up is Amy Olson-Clifford, who is joining us tonight. She is a development manager and lives here in Indianapolis. We are so glad you could join us. What is your question for the candidates?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Stewart. As most Hoosiers and Americans would like to see the incidence of abortions go down, what is your position, each of you, on sex education and birth control to ensure that people are well informed and know how to avoid unplanned pregnancies?
Our first response will come from Rebecca Sink-Burris.
Well, thank you for that question. It is an important issue. However, it is not a federal issue. It is an issue that should be handled at the state level. And the states should make the rules about such things as abortion. And what's going to happen is different states will have different rules. And as our founders intended, the states were to be incubators of ideas and trying things. If they didn't work out, well, they could be scrapped. But at least they wouldn't be set over the entire country and have a bad effect that way. Now, I'm in favor of responsible behavior. There are enough different methods of birth control in this day and age that there should be very few unwanted pregnancies. As far as sex education goes, I'm in favor of school choice so that you can have your children educated in the way that you want, whether that includes sex education or does not include sex education. That would be up to the parents. Personally, as a parent, I found the earlier, the better that you talk to your children about these issues when they're still willing to listen to you before they hit the teenage years. And I would like to see abortions down as low as possible. Rare, safe, but never paid for by tax dollars.
Our next response will come from Dan Coates.
Well, I'm a believer that life begins at conception, that life is given to us by our Creator. It is sacred. It is not the responsibility of government to decide who lives and who doesn't live. I believe the unborn need protection and the elderly need protection from decisions that take lives. This is one of the defining issues, I think, in who we are as a people. We have always been inclusive in reaching out to those that are disabled, those that are handicapped, those that don't enjoy the full benefits of life that many of us do. And the unborn and the elderly fall in those categories. As far as sex education and birth control, it's not the responsibility of the federal government. It's not the purview of the state government or any government. It's the decision that ought to be decided between parents and their children. So I cannot support something that would put a federal program or a state program or any kind of government program deciding what to teach my children or my friends' children or anybody else's children regarding issues of life and regarding issues of sex education.
And finally, Brad Ellsworth.
I think that the candidates are pretty much in agreement on this issue. I'm a pro-life Democrat. I'm proud of that. I've got a 100% pro-life voting record. And I think that pro-life folks and pro-choice folks should be working together to cut down on the need and or the feeling of need for an abortion. You know, this argument has gone on and will continue to go on. So the more we can do to work together to reduce the number of unwanted pregnancies, which will in turn reduce abortions. Mr. Coates and I agree that it's all life. Respect the unborn, respect young children, and do what's right for the elderly. All life should be respected. And I think however we work together, whether that's working together to talk about birth control and sex education, we have to have all the arrows in the quiver to do this so that a woman or a young girl isn't forced into the time when they have to make a decision whether to terminate a pregnancy.
Retirement savings are on the minds of many Americans with all of the turmoil that's taken place over the past several years on Wall Street, and Social Security is a key part of Americans' retirement security. And so with that in mind, I'd like to bring our next question on behalf of Albert Ford Jr., who is a retiree from Indianapolis. Are you in favor of privatizing Social Security in any way? And are you in favor of raising the age at which Americans can receive Social Security retirement benefits? And we would like to start with Dan Coates.
I think we all know that our entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, are in serious trouble as the baby boom retires and as the number of workers feeding money into the funds diminishes. These funds are facing some funding crises in the future. Now, for years and years and years, Congress has kind of kicked the can down the road and said, well, we'll let the next Congress deal with that, or the next president deal with that. Really, the time has run out. We do need to look at how we can restructure those programs in a way that preserve and save the hard-earned payments that taxpayers have put into those funds and the guarantees that we have to provide them their retirement income that they had planned on through their working lives. And so, yes, there needs to be a look at a whole variety, a menu of options regarding how we can do that. Raising the retirement age is one thing that has been suggested. I think we should take a serious look at that. We did that in 1984. We've moved it to 66 in a couple of months. Maybe moving it to 67 or 67 and a half is a way to go forward to preserve Social Security, to make sure we're not taking people off of that. There are also sensible changes, long-range changes that can be looked at. It ought to be on the table. We ought to have an adult conversation. We ought to step up and stop playing politics with this. We're talking about people's retirement and people's medical care, and we want to preserve those programs.
Mr. Coates, your time has expired. Now to Brad Ellsworth.
Well, thank you. I think that Social Security is a successful program. I think we've done it a huge injustice by robbing the fund over the years. I think that's something we have to stop directly. Secondly, when we concentrate on putting people back to work and people have jobs, they'll be paying into Social Security, which will make it solvent. I oppose the privatization of Social Security. Had we done that and we went through this economic turmoil, imagine what would have happened to our Social Security trust funds or our fund had it been privatized. And I'm against raising the age. 70 is not that old. It's still a very viable age. But when you're on the end of a jackhammer, you're a construction worker, it's a little different. Mr. Coates' position kind of stuns me because he's already endorsed early in the campaign, he endorsed the Paul Ryan plan, which does privatize Social Security and eventually eliminates it. And yet he said that, and then when people started to back off and you heard that the polls weren't against that, he changed his position and said, no, I'm not privatizing. I think it's just another example of where Dan Coates says one thing in Indiana or in Washington and comes back and says another thing with the change of the wind.
And now Rebecca Sink-Burris.
Social Security is insolvent. It's a Ponzi scheme. It was set up as a Ponzi scheme. And unlike Bernie Madoff, who only hurt a certain number of people, a limited number of people, hurt them badly, and he's in jail for it, thank heavens, Social Security is perpetrated over the entire United States. That's what happens when you put government in charge of your retirement or of any other program. If it's not done well, it hurts the entire country. That's why such things should be handled at the state level so that the states can experiment and find out what works that way. We have to, in anything that we do to Social Security, so that it does remain solvent, we have to make sure that the elderly, those who are already on Social Security, are protected. We have to keep those promises. And I don't think anyone disagrees with that. But statistically, it is a very bad deal for younger workers, and it cannot be sustained in the current way. What we need to do is, there's one suggestion. Now, there's many ways to tackle this, but one way is to take our Social Security taxes, half of which are paid by the employee, half by the employer, and let the half that the employee pays be put into an account like a 401k that worker would own, and the government would not be able to borrow from it to pay for general fund spending.
Ms. Sink-Burris, thank you very much. Mark Colivrat, who works as a cashier and who lives in Indianapolis, submitted our next question. He would like to know the following. In your official role as a United States Senator, what would your position be if faced with casting votes on the related issues of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy concerning gays in the military, or a constitutional amendment to define marriage as only between a man and a woman? And I'd like for each of you to take 45 seconds to respond to this question, and we will start with Ms. Sink-Burris.
I don't really understand what the federal government has to do with marriage, whether it's heterosexual marriage or a marriage of same-sex couple. It's not in the Constitution. It belongs at the state level, and it should be done through contracts. Everyone should have a marriage contract, and the state is charged with enforcing contracts. So we can take that problem off. If people want to have a marriage in a traditional marriage, they can go to a church and have their wedding sanctified in any way that they choose. But under the law, every person in this country has to be treated equally. As far as don't ask, don't tell, I would...
Unfortunately, your time has expired. I warned you, 45 seconds. Mr. Coates.
I believe marriage is between a man and a woman. That's been the way it has been since the beginning of time, and I think that's the way it should be. This doesn't mean someone can't choose to live an alternative lifestyle, but just don't call it marriage. Marriage is a union between a man and a woman that I think we ought to retain. Secondly, and don't ask, don't tell, I was part of the effort that negotiated that with the Democrat, Sam Nunn, as leader, and signed by Bill Clinton. It has worked and effectively because it has kept our military, who had testified significantly on the difficulty of that issue, and they now have another study in place why the Congress, Congressman Ellsworth, House, that Congressman Ellsworth bill supported to repeal that before hearing from the military.
Your time has expired. Mr. Ellsworth.
Quickly, I believe that marriage should be kept to being between one man and one woman. In regards to don't ask, don't tell, I fall in line with Secretary Gates, General Colin Powell, and Admiral Mullen that don't ask, don't tell is coming to an end. We're forcing anyone who is going to go fight for our country and possibly be injured and or killed for our country, they should have the right to serve. We're forcing them to lie, and we're spending billions of dollars kicking good soldiers out of our military.
And now we have reached our final question of the evening. And relax, you're back to 90 seconds. Joining us tonight is Mindy Goodpaster, a social worker from Zionsville, Indiana. What is your question for the candidates?
Thank you. The current administration vowed to change Washington and end partisan politics. However, it seems as though the political climate is more partisan than ever. If elected senator, what will you do to encourage more collaboration across parties to better serve the American people?
And we will start with Brad Ellsworth.
Thank you for that question. It's very simple and it's very important that we need to send people to Washington. My career in law enforcement was about resolving disputes, respecting all sides and going out and listening to all sides, and then try to fix the problem as best you can. It wasn't about Republicans and Democrats. It wasn't about rich or poor, black and white. You just went and tried to solve the problem. That's what people don't like about Washington. You're exactly right. And they want the truth. They want somebody that's going to serve others and serve the public and not serve themselves. There's lots of things we can do. One thing we can do is stop senators and congressmen from going to become lobbyists. I'll sponsor legislation that says put a lifetime ban. Then we know they really will come home after they suggest that and come home to the people they represent. That needs to happen. Again, civility has to be returned to Washington, D.C. These problems that face our country are not just Republican and Democrat problems. No one has a corner on the market on good ideas. We should be working together. I've always been that way in Congress. I have one of the most independent voting records in the House of Representatives. That's proven. They can say all day long, I'm a 90% voter. It's not true. True critics know that. And so working together, not stereotyping one side from the other, is extremely important. And that's the kind of people we should research and send to Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Mr. Ellsworth. Rebecca Sink-Burris.
If you want government to change, and if you want the atmosphere in Congress and the Senate to change, you need to stop wasting your vote on the old parties. You need to send a party to Washington who cares about the people in the country and the people in this state, who is not beholden to special interests, who is not worrying about what committee they're going to get on, someone who can work with both sides of the aisle, as well as combine with people who have agreed on controversial issues and have come together. There are several plans right now that have been agreed to by quite a few people and are in favor of it, as far as even cutting military spending or in ways to save Social Security. I would join with those kind of people in the Senate. But you can't count on the old parties to change. It just isn't going to happen. And if you continue voting for them, they will continue to ignore you. If you don't vote, they can ignore you. But if you vote for a libertarian, they know that you want to change. They know you have seen through the smokescreen of how totally different they are, both the parties of big government, and that you want small, constitutionally limited government. So don't waste your vote this time. Check out my website, electrebecca.com.
Thank you. And now to Dan Coates.
This is not about civility or go along, get along. Our country is in a serious recession. Unemployment is higher than it's been since the Great Depression. We're entering the third year. And we have a government, Obama-Pelosi agenda, that yes, my opponent did support nearly 90% of the time, as proven and demonstrated by the Washington Post and an independent study, that has supported this massive spending and plunge into debt, that is putting our country into second-tier status and is putting our children at risk and our grandchildren that not have the kind of opportunities that we have had. We have a serious problem that we have to address. It. We don't go there and sing kumbaya across the aisle. We got to hold this party responsible for taking us absolutely in the wrong direction, plunging us into debt. We're now entering a third year of a serious recession. Kids graduating from college can't get a job. Kids graduating from high school can't get a job. We got serious problems, and this party goes on and says, well, no, let's enact a health care spending. Let's put a stimulus in place. It didn't stimulate anything except a lot of more government workers in Washington, D.C. We had bailouts of companies and some of the bailouts of the banks and entities that caused some of this problem in the first place. the spending is beyond comprehension, and we've got to put a stop to it. And the stop to it is not by raising taxes, it's by cutting back on Washington, going back to principles of limited government, and dealing with serious questions in serious ways instead of just pointing at the other person and saying, well, he's done that or he's done this or whatever.
Thank you, Mr. Coates. And thank you for watching the 2010 U.S. Senate debate sponsored by the Indiana Debate Commission. Our thanks to the candidates, Dan Coates, Brad Ellsworth, and Rebecca Sink-Burris, and to their staffs for their assistance this evening. We would also like to thank our broadcast partners, WFYI-TV and WTHR-TV in Indianapolis and WITU in Bloomington, Indiana. We would also like to thank our hosts, the University Place Conference Center, IUPUI, and its Chancellor, Charles Bantz. And special thanks to the voters who asked questions tonight. You can submit your own question to the candidates for our October 22nd debate in Fort Wayne or the October 25th debate in Vincennes. To do so, just log on to our website, indianadebatecommission.com. On behalf of the Indiana Debate Commission, good night.